This is a review of the Iconntechs 4K Ultra HD action camera. This is a low-cost alternative to the GoPro and actually provides quite a few usable features for those that are looking into getting an action camera but don't have $400 to drop on a GoPro. Some of the positives of this particular camera include it actually has pretty decent video for the price that you're paying. I'll delve deeper into that later, but that is definitely something that surprised me. The video was actually pretty good for the price point. I know that the camera boasts that it can do 4K. Now, I take some issue with that. It's not exactly meeting a 4K standard per se, as far as the resolution that it's shooting at, but all things aside, really 4K is not something that consumer level users are really going to need. There's nothing wrong with 4K, it's actually great, and if you can get something that can shoot in 4K really nicely, it's great. The thing is that most people are going to be using 1080p at 30 and 60. That still kind of dominates the market right now. So while this camera boasts that it can do 4K, really I don't see very many people utilizing 4K necessarily. Maybe you do, maybe I'm out of the loop and everybody and their mother is using 4K, but right now I still think that 1080p is by far the most useful setting on this camera for the kind of stuff that most people want to do, which is, you know, action shots, YouTube videos, stuff like that. 1080p is perfect for that. It's the perfect size. It's the perfect, you know, you can load it up in the computer. It doesn't overwhelm most modern computers like 4K video could. It's just an easy format to work with. The one problem, though, with the 1080p is that it doesn't shoot at the same bitrate that a GoPro does. So how does bitrate play into this? You can shoot video on two different cameras at 1080p at 30 and 60 frames per second, but get vastly different results, and it's all based on bitrate. Bitrate is the amount of data that your camera is picking up as it's shooting in whatever particular setting that you have it in, whatever resolution setting you have it, and however many frames per second you have it set at. So the higher the bitrate, the higher quality the video is going to be. Now, if you look at the two different video files that I've pulled up, and you look at the bit rates, the Iconntechs camera is shooting at, if I remember correctly, it's 14, a bit rate of 14, and the GoPro is shooting at a bit rate of 41. So the amount of digital data that is being captured by the GoPro is vastly more than the Iconntechs. So they both do 1080p at 60 and 30, but consistently the GoPro video will look better than the Iconntechs video. Now, the nice thing is that most people don't really notice the difference when it comes to video. A bitrate of 14 is more than adequate for a lot of things. So if you're not somebody who's looking to get the absolute most pristine videos, you just want to get some stuff where you're like, you know, snowboarding or surfing or something, and this is going to work great for you. Now, if you're a nerd like me that has to have absolutely high quality 1080p, I'm always going to go to things like the GoPro because that's what I want. But if you're somebody who just wants to gather a couple shots of you doing some cool stuff, this camera might be the exact thing that you're looking for. One other great thing is that it actually had more settings than I expected it to. Really, I was surprised at the amount of settings that are in this camera and the different things that you can do with it. Yeah, it had its own equivalent, I guess you can call it the GoPro Pro Tune settings. It had its own version of Pro Tune settings. Now, I'm sure they're not as robust as the actual GoPro Pro Tune settings in general. I mean, I think the ISO limits were only went up to 400. So, I mean, that gives you an example of how the Iconntechs camera was a little bit lacking in that regard. But nonetheless, it's a pretty good offering as far as settings go and all the different things you can do with your video. One other thing that's really cool that it has on there is digital zoom. I know, it's crazy. It's nice to see that some companies are getting into actually utilizing digital zoom in action cameras. I know it doesn't necessarily make sense because the idea behind an action camera is to capture video close up or in close proximity. So digital zoom doesn't necessarily make sense because the assumption is that you're already going to be close up to what you're going to be shooting. But there have been a number of situations where I've used my action camera, my GoPro, where I wish that I had a digital zoom on it because it would have made a huge difference in being able to capture like wildlife and what have you. I do a lot of hiking and what have you, so it would have been nice to capture wildlife or to be able to zoom into something that I can't necessarily walk to. For the most part, it will work with GoPro accessories. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to fit in any of the cases because, frankly, this item already comes with cases, and it actually looks like it's a little bit different shape than your run-of-the-mill GoPro. So I don't know if it's going to necessarily fit in all those cases, but the one nice thing is that the 3 prongs, or rather the 2 and the 3 prongs that come together, those are all the same. So you're going to be able to use all the different mounts that you have for GoPro, and basically the system is exactly the same. You use your screw to screw together the mounts, and then you got a pretty solid connection to your action camera. It actually takes decent pictures. The max setting for this camera is 20 megapixels, and it actually produces some pretty nice shots. I was really surprised. You know, they do look a little bit weird and elongated because I had the setting on the 170, but it's actually not too bad for what this little package. I mean, it takes a pretty good picture, I have to admit. As far as the Android app is concerned and Wi-Fi, this camera does well. It connected. I had a little trouble finding the app that actually uses this camera uses, but once I found it, it connected very easily, and I was able to control the device from my cell phone. I was able to frame shots. There was hardly any lag. It actually worked out pretty well. Now, some of the cons. Nothing wrong with the battery in general, but it doesn't work with any of the GoPro 4 or 3 batteries. So you have to buy your own specific batteries for these. So if you've got a GoPro 3 and you want to utilize this camera as a secondary camera, just realize that you're going to have to buy a couple extra batteries. Now, the one positive is that these batteries are cheap. They're $12.99 for a couple of them. It's really not that big a deal, but it did kind of surprise me that they didn't model the battery based off of some previous version of a GoPro, which would have allowed a lot of people a lot of freedom to just be able to essentially plug and play. They can take multiple batteries and not have to buy batteries on top of batteries to make sure that their second camera worked. One other thing that I didn't like about the camera is the micro SD card. What it said in the book is that the maximum that it'll take is a 32 gigabyte micro SD card and some 64 and 128 gigabyte cards, but it doesn't enumerate which ones those are. It's just some. So I guess it's a crapshoot that if you have a 64K or a 64 gigabyte card or a 128 card, it may or may not work with this thing. Now, the good thing was is that I had a 32 gigabyte card that I was able to plug in, and it worked fine. Which is, I mean, 32 gigs at this bit rate is going to be a massive amount of storage, but nonetheless, it's just something to keep in mind that I kind of was surprised about. That just, well, some work, some don't. We're not going to tell you which ones work because we're not going to bother to try them. Alright, thanks. Just know that if you got a 32 gigabyte card, you should be fine. 64 may or may not work for you. The micro USB charging slot doesn't allow for a microphone. That's one other thing that I really like about my GoPro. I use a secondary microphone on my GoPro, and it actually comes out with pretty pristine sound. Now, I'm sure you can tell by now that the sound on this particular camera sounds a little bit thin. It's not quite there yet, and an exterior microphone would have been nice, but just know that if you're going to use a microphone, and I haven't tested this, but I'm just using this as as a theory, that you're going to need something that uses a micro SD slot, if it even works. Now, I know it works with the GoPro, but no guarantees with this particular camera, so it was kind of a bummer that I wasn't able to try that out to see if a external microphone could work with it. The last and probably the most concerning thing per se would be the lens size. Now, the lens size, what am I getting at with this? On my GoPro, I like to run the GoPro by itself in the frame mount because it produces the best sound, and also allows me to plug in my microphone really easily without having to worry about destroying the GoPro. One other thing that I really like about that is when I have it in the frame mount, I have a cover that I can put over the lens to protect the lens. Like I said, I do a lot of hiking, so I'm in environments where there's a lot of rocks, a lot of dirt, and what have you, so it's nice to be able to protect the lens. The lens on this particular camera is a little bit smaller than you would get with a GoPro, so it doesn't quite fit, like the different lens covers that I have don't quite fit, so you're kind of stuck using the skeleton case with this if you want to protect the lens. Or wherever you go, you're going to have to be uber careful about protecting the lens because there is no protection for the lens, especially if you're using it in a frame mount or the frame style mount. So that was something that I kind of was bummed about, because the last thing I want to do is throw this camera into the skeleton case, shut the door on a waterproof case, and then try to get some kind of sound out of it. So I think that that's something that probably in future models can be worked on to match the standard of GoPro. to allow people to use the frame mount case along with some kind of a lens cover that will protect the lens so that you don't have to use the skeleton case. All in all, this camera is a good camera. Don't get me wrong. You know, if, like I said, if you're looking to just get a couple shots of you doing some cool sports or whatever it is that you want to do with your camera, this camera is going to be more than adequate for you, especially if you're going to be utilizing 1080p video.